This week, Kismet Man of Fate, the first known Muslim superhero. In 1944, he appeared in all 4 issues of a series called Bomber Comics. Then the series was canceled and Kismet was forgotten, until a few years ago when the character was revived in stories by writer A. David Lewis and artist Noel Tuazon. Lewis joins me to talk about the history of the character and the revival, and then Will Weaver and I review the revival book, Kismet Man of Fate, Volume 1, Boston Strong. But first, as the pandemic goes on, my overall monthly income is taking a hit. I really appreciate the support from our current patrons, which offsets hosting costs, book purchases, and the like, but I've kept my other jobs at a level that just pays the bills, so I have time to podcast, and I'm not sure how much longer that will remain viable. I might have to get a real job, but you can keep Deconstructing Comics alive by supporting us on Patreon. With your pledge, you can access hours of bonus podcasts of Mulele and me reviewing Marvel Comics movies. You can join me to discuss the comic of your choice on the show, and more. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
This is Will.
And this
Hello,
is
Tim.
Hello, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Will from John Carroll University in University Heights, Ohio. How are you?
Lovely. Glad to be with you again.
Yeah, he's been on several times before. We talked about, never mind. I can't remember the names of the comics we talked about. We talked about Ghost World. That's one I remember.
Yes, indeed.
So this time the topic is Kismet, Man of Fate, who was the first Muslim superhero way back in 1944, and was resurrected after his copyright expired in 2014. And so first you're going to hear me interviewing the man who's been writing Kismet's new adventures, A. David Lewis. And then Will and I will be back to talk about the revival comic, which is called Kismet Man of Fate, Volume 1, Boston Strong. So, first, here's the interview. Okay, I'm talking now to A. David Lewis in Boston. How are you?
I'm doing well, Tim. How are you?
I'm okay. Right, so first of all, just introduce yourself. Tell the listeners who you are.
I am. You're right. A. David Lewis. I do reside on the outskirts of Boston. I am both a college educator in the health humanities, and I am a comic book scholar and writer, which I imagine is why I was invited here today, because while teaching is a noble profession, it's not always podcast worthy. No, I both study and write various comics. The focus of my research has been on religious characters as well as graphic medicine, that is, comic books and healthcare. But my output currently, my creative output, has been a number of graphic novels, most recently Kismet Man of Fate. Is that a good segue?
Yeah, okay. Well, so yeah, tell me about the history of Kismet, because he goes back to before we were born.
Oh, yeah. He goes back to the 1940s, in fact. And it wouldn't be surprising if this is the first time your listeners have heard about him, because he basically fell off the scene from the 1940s until the present day. The character became part of the public domain. But in the 1940s, he was included in the Bomber Comics series of titles, basically an anthology magazine of daring and adventure, and he was their Muslim superhero character, probably the first one in comics. And so Kismet fought for the Allies in World War II. He was their Algerian operative in France, working with Free France against Axis powers. But shortly after 1944, when Bomber Comics folded after only 4 issues, the character was sort of forgotten. And
so he was only in those 4 issues.
That's right.
In 1944.
That's right.
And we should mention this: the publisher was Elliott Publishing. At least that's what Wikipedia says.
Yeah, it was Elliott and Gilberton was another name that they went by, and they are most famous. They're most famous for Classics Illustrated. But in fact, they were just the publisher. What many publishers of the time did was actually hire or contract creative studios to mass produce creative content for them. So what we also know, even though Elliott was the publisher, it was actually created by the S.M. Iger studio. That was formerly the Eisner and Iger studio, Will Eisner being the famous name for which the Eisner Awards in comics are named after. But yeah, it was definitely produced by them and was likely written and created by one of the rare female talents of the time, Ruth Roach, even though she and one of her artists, might have been Chuck Winter, one of her artists wrote under the pen name Omar Tahan to maybe make it sound more exotic or Middle Eastern or more authentic, writing about a Muslim Algerian hero.
And I notice here that apparently Matt Baker worked on this somewhat. We talked about Matt Baker on the podcast a few months ago.
Well, we're uncertain about precisely who the artist was. It seems to line up best with Chuck Winter if you compare the work he did, presumably on Kismet, to work he did on Liberty Bell. There's a number of stylistic similarities, but it's quite possible it was another artist like Baker as well.
Yeah, I see the Wikipedia says it could have been these guys or these guys who drew it. Matt Baker is one of the possibilities, but
right.
So after 1944, then he never appeared for decades. And at what point did he go out of copyright?
Well, it was a 70-year copyright, so by 2014, he was very much open. No one could argue his public domain status. I know that a few pieces of fan fiction were written. I know that there was an RPG, a role-playing game out there that was using Golden Age heroes on the premise that no one owned them anymore. But by 2014, and when I became interested in the character for more than academic reasons, those books were officially named public domain materials.
Okay. Now, does Kismet have some superpowers?
I think he does. Certainly the way I write him, yes, he does. If you look at the original adventures, he is basically this expert in fisticuffs. He is this peerless hand-to-hand combatant. And a few of his lines, a few of his sort of hokier lines are about seeing the foreseen or fate unfolding as he predicted. So, in addition to expert-level athletics and gymnastics and a high peak human ability there, he also has what I call his sense, not F-O-R-E sense, and the idea that he can glimpse a fraction of the second into the future. Okay. That he can just get a flash. He knows that a right hook is coming. He knows that the bomb is about to explode around the corner.
So it's kind of like spider sense.
Yeah, a little bit of Spidey sense, a little bit of the way they describe the Force in one of the prequels of the Star Wars prequels. But I liked the idea that if there was any superpower that was coming from a mystical or religious or even divine source, and it's not exactly said which one of those is operating in my stories, I like this idea of just being in on the unfolding of time, being just let in a little bit on events as they were to happen next, because it really put into question the idea that I enjoy of predetermination and free will. Whether or not things are going to happen as they were supposed to happen, or if all actions are the result of many millions, billions, and trillions of choices. So this ability that he has throws all that into question. And it makes him a man of fate.
Okay.
His name, his moniker.
Now, I haven't had a chance to read those 1944 stories, but how was the treatment of the character? Did anything come off as kind of stereotyped?
Well, I suppose so, but not the things that you would expect to come off as stereotype. He is very noble. He's very genteel. He's nowhere near what I feared when I first did research on the character, of him being some sort of savage, or being backwards, or being in some way inferior to another race or another demographic. The part that's more stereotyped is his daring do, is his bravado. He's much more a swashbuckler on land, if anything. He does have a few hokey lines, I think I mentioned. He'll say the equivalent of, with Superman, they used to have Perry White say, "By Great Caesar's ghost," or they used to have Superman yell out, "By Rao, I can't believe." He had his own version of that. I think it was "by Muhammad's beard," or by Allah's spirit, or just one of these things that no one would actually say out loud, particularly not a Muslim. But it was to denote the character as Muslim, and yet appear an equal, a fellow hero. So in that regard, I really liked the character, and I wanted him to develop further. And it turned out the only way I could do that was to do it myself. Other quirks about the character. He's wearing a fez that no one would wear, right? He's running around shirtless but with gloves, which looks ridiculous. And he is he's almost cavalier. He's almost not taking the enormity of the circumstances into account. He's fighting and flipping and adventuring and running away and fighting again, all with just like zeal, which I found fun. Ultimately, was entirely the opposite of the horribly stereotyped character I expected to encounter based on my other research, based on other Muslim characters. This was the first Muslim superhero, and it came off okay.
Now, what kind of stereotypes were there about Muslims back then? Because that was long before the era of like Islamic terrorism and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's true. But since the World War II had gone especially global, and I would say even prior to that, there were stereotypes about the Turks and about turning Turk and about the harem that they keep at home of many wives, and about how they would sooner cut your tongue off than talk to you. So the hot-blooded Turk or Muslim. I mean, even America had its first treaty with Tripoli when it was first after the Revolutionary War. Tripoli was the first country it had its first treaty with, but it also had its first war with what we call the Barbary Coast, the Barbary Isles. That's where we use the term barbarian from. So either Muslims were portrayed, or Turks or Arabs, were portrayed as sometimes bumbling, sometimes throwback, very not modern, not technologically advanced, not particularly smart, or they were highly sexualized, highly hot-blooded, and highly violent. I didn't find any of these in Kismet, and I had to wonder if it wasn't because of Ruth Roach. I had to wonder if these stereotypes just didn't appeal to her to write about, that she didn't think that these would be hooks on which she could base the character. He is still something of a lake, but with manners, which you wouldn't necessarily expect reading the popular fiction of the day when it comes to Arabs or it came to Persians or Muslims in general. They were very much grouped together as other. But Kismet's shirtlessness, I suspect, is the sole holdover from that much more grossly stereotyped vision.
Okay.
Picture, I mean, maybe your audiences will be familiar with the animated Aladdin movie. All except Aladdin. They basically, Disney was running with a similar stereotype. If you think about the guards with scimitars from the palace, or the harem.
When you were talking about the 40s stereotypes, I was thinking of that line in that song in the Disney Aladdin that became kind of controversial.
Exactly. It did not come from nowhere. It was very much already in effect by that time. And so to have so little of that, not only to have so little of that show up in the comic, but to have Kismet actually be a respected character in the comic. The Allies like working with Kismet. He is renowned. Women feel safe with him. And this is very heteronormative. I understand that. We can't expect all things from all people back in the 40s.
Yeah.
But for him not to be seen as the enemy of an enemy as my friend, but instead a true ally, was heartwarming. Might be too strong a word, but it was certainly, for me, inspiring to do more with the character.
I see. Now, are you very familiar with the Kismet appearance? So before you started working with him in the Broken Frontier anthology?
That's when I started working with him.
Okay, so yeah, tell me about that anthology and what I just got a little bit of information from Wikipedia, but
yeah, no problem. The Broken Frontier anthology spun out of the Broken Frontier news and media website, and I actually wrote for Broken Frontier as a columnist and reviewer. And when they decided to team up with publisher A Wave Blue World to create an anthology, I said, look, there's a character I'd really like to do. I'd like to give him a final adventure. I just need 10 pages just to give him a send-off. That was at least what I thought I was going to do. And that was approximately the length of each one of the pieces in the Broken Frontier anthology. So they said, great. I believe I connected with artist Noel Tuazon through a mutual friend, Josh Hale Fielkoff. They worked together on the Eisner-nominated book Tumor, and I thought his work was just gorgeous. So we connected, and I said, I'd like to do a final story of Kismet set in World War II. Why haven't we heard from him? Did he just disappear? What happened to him? We also had colorist Rob Cronenborgs join us and letterer Kel Nuttall, and we got to tell this end of the war story of Kismet, of his final mission, of a great betrayal by one of his intelligence handlers, and how he actually, going back to the earlier subject, he foresaw the death of this traitorous handler, of his friend, but still his betrayer, and he tried to thwart fate. He tried to keep it from happening. And as such, he fails, actually. The man still dies. But Kismet seems to be either punished or swept away or transported, but basically taken out of the scene, out of the 40s, to points unknown. And I originally was just satisfied with leaving it at that, sort of thematic. He fell into the public domain and the character fell out of our reality, so to speak. But we had such a great time making this. I had a great time making this, and I really gelled with much of the art team that even once it was over and Broken Frontier published their anthology, I still wanted to do more. And at first, I decided, okay, I'm going to keep it small. I'll just do 1 or 2 more of those 10-page stories. I'll find another anthology to put them in. I'll fund it myself. It'll be my pastime here. It'll be my creative outlet of the moment. And so I did 2 more stories. And then at the end of those 2 stories, A Wave Blue World came back to me and said, well, I don't know if they approached me or I approached them, to be fair, but we reconnected. Mm-hmm. And decided that, look, we could do Kismet as a graphic novel, as an ongoing series of graphic novels. And so then the gloves were off. Then I could get rid of this 10-page format in my head and start thinking about a larger adventure.
I see. So you sent me a PDF of that book. There was no cover in the file, but also...
Right.
I don't know. Starting to read it, I felt like I was coming in a part 2.
No. What actually happened was there were no chapter divides provided to you, so you didn't know what was prologue, right, and what was chapter 1, chapter 2, epilogue, afterward, and so forth. Yeah, I sent you the art file, but it didn't include any of the publisher's cover, table of contents, indicia, and chapter divide. So, no, you weren't actually coming in on chapter 2. You're coming on. It had the collected items from Broken Frontier and those little extras that I did along the side, and they sort of bookend the main news story that I did for that volume, what we call the Volume 1 Boston Strong storyline.
I don't know. I felt like there were some things that I didn't quite. I felt like I was being expected to understand that I didn't understand, like how Kismet is like invisible to some point, and
sure. When one of the shorter stories that's included in the back explains why he's even here in the present again. Okay. And that backstory that I include later, which never saw print. The first time seeing print was in that volume.
Okay.
But that backstory explains that he basically is pulled back into reality by means of a ancestor. Excuse me, ancestor? Predecessor. No, ancestor.
Ancestor.
Of his. And while one of them is operating in our tactile reality, the other one is in this side space, in this sort of ghostly, intangible zone. I remember reading, before it was Carol Danvers, the Captain Marvel comics, where he would switch spaces with Rick Jones. And Rick Jones would...
the Peter David run.
And so I sort of took that premise there, that's where he had been all these times for reasons undetermined in this ghostly side space.
Okay.
But now he was getting access back to the main world, back to the physical reality, because of this connection to Qadr, to his modern-day relative.
Okay, yeah, I didn't have time to read the whole thing, so I didn't see that part. Okay.
That's okay.
So you place the story in Boston because you live in Boston?
Yeah, this is a little bit of write what you know. That's true. I've been born and raised in the Boston area. I took a few years off to live and work in Washington, D.C., but I've been a New Englander pretty much all my life. And it just seemed like a setting that both hadn't had a lot of superheroism associated with it, but also could allow for a superhero character to grow out of that role, not feel stuck in some template or mold. So I was excited to bring him to like scenes and settings and places that I was quite familiar with, but to let this, 70-year-old character explore them with new eyes.
Okay. Now I was also surprised by all the references to real world events kind of before and after the 2016 election. Well, why did you decide to implant it so firmly in our reality?
I think because I wanted to show the continuing theme, the idea of why Kismet, why now, why should we care about this old character that everyone's forgotten until now? I wanted a character that was created and had the mission of fighting fascism, real fascism, true fascism from the 40s, and with what was in the air by 2016, before Trump's election, but even leading up to it, I wanted a character who had that background to be facing this reality and deciding how and where he should position himself. I didn't want to create a fake fascism or a fake bad guy. I instead wanted him to do with the events that I had been living. And in this way, it got to be just a touch of autobiography. Obviously, I'm not a superhero. Obviously, I'm not running around with a fez on my head and so forth. But it did let the characters work through the same questions that I had in any of these moments, with the 2014 marathon bombing, with the rise of not just the Tea Party, but the alt-right, and then with the election of the Trump administration. Setting it in this real-world context not only made the character a little bit less outlandish and maybe the conceit a little bit less laughable, but also let me reflect on not just my experience, but the experience of all those around me here in Boston, and I think more widely across the country.
Mm-hmm. I see. So tell me a little more about the people you worked on this with. Who are they?
It's a strangely international team. I mean, for a book that I'm setting in Boston and dealing with political concerns here in the U.S., we have, as I said, Nolt, who's based in Canada, and he works in the field. When he's not working on comics, he works in the field of animation and of storyboarding. So he does great jobs with catching moment-to-moment transitions and facial and bodily reactions that just it really spoke to me when I saw his work, and I was excited to have that on Kismet. Rob Cronenborg is European. He's overseas. He makes his own amazing and wild sort of comics, much more blood and gore and really, really powerful stuff. But I liked his colors particularly, and I liked just the added, I want to say, texture or sketchiness he could bring to it over what were Noel's rather clean lines. And then rounding out the group, we have Taylor Esposito of Glyph Studios. Taylor is an amazing letterer, and I think it's a saying that you hear a lot of people say that, you know, like a sound technician, if you don't notice the letterer, they're doing a good job.
Yeah.
But even so, even if you don't, you know, relate it to a particular person, to Taylor's skills, he's finding ways to just make these character voices and these destinations, these scenes that I set, just so distinct and clear and unmuddied, because I'm a wordy writer, and it's something I'm trying to get away from, but I am verbose, and I pity the art team that I work with. Yeah, you noticed that. It's the academic side of me. It's, you know, fair enough. It totally comes from having to hit a word limit for a paper or an essay or whatnot. Maybe Volume 2 will cut that back a bit, but for Volume 1, he had a lot to work with and a lot of styles to incorporate, and he does it beautifully. Okay. Finally, we did have a wonderful cover artist, which is Natasha Alterici, who you may know from her work on Heathen for Vault Comics.
Okay.
I saw her work on LGBTQ positive Nordic mythology, and I'm like, that's the kind of progressive but out there mix. I would love to find a place for in this comic, in this series. So her being on the cover work, and then Nicola Black taking care of design and making it very distinct, and yet again, like Taylor, not jarring, but rather seamless. It was just a beautiful team effort, and I couldn't be more proud of how the first volume turned out. It's why we're working again on a second volume, just because we want to do it again, and I want to write even more effectively for this team.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to ask if there was going to be more, and there is, but where can people get the first volume?
Well, you can buy the first volume from Amazon. That's probably the most catch-all, but we are getting it back into comic shops this month, this early fall. So if they want to buy it electronically, I would say Amazon, but if they want to buy it from their shops, they just have to request it, that an order is put into through their retailer, and we will send it direct to them. Finally, Volume 2 is being crowdfunded on Patreon. We decided not to go the Kickstarter route or the Indiegogo route, and instead we're going to do a slow burn month to month through Patreon, which has so far been rather successful.
I see. Okay. So when do you expect that one to be finished?
That all depends on what level of support we get, right? That is to say, if I set the mark at, for every $140 we raise, we make another page. That's the fair price cost of paying Noel, of paying Rob, of paying Taylor, taking care of taxes and taking care of Patreon. I see none of that money at all. So if we can generate $140 a month, that's a page a month, and then the storyline could go anywhere from 80 to 120 pages. That's very lengthy. But if we start generating enough funds to do 2 pages a month, 3 pages a month, it could be here inside of 2 years. The goal is less about completing it and more continuing to move through this journey while there's a pandemic upon us. I mean, I want to get my artists supported, but I also don't want to gouge people while things are very difficult. So that's why we're inviting people to make small money pledges from one month to another, rather than some big overwieldy price tag just to get it out quickly, just to get it out the next year.
I see. Okay. Interesting approach. But yeah, that's good. Oh, one other question I do want to ask you.
Yes.
Are the original Kismet comics available anywhere?
Yeah, there are some reprinting, repackaging places. I mean, again, I found them on Amazon and eBay. People that will sell you reprints of them. If you want the originals, you're going to have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars. But yes, in fact, one thing we're considering doing in conjunction with this crowdfunding for Volume 2 is releasing the original 4 stories from the 4 different Bomber comics as one self-contained and probably free volume. So they can look for that as well.
I see. Okay, interesting.
Kismet issue 0.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Coming up, Will Weaver joins me to review Kismet Man of Fate Volume 1, Boston Strong. You may have noticed that I'm no longer republishing the earliest episodes of Deconstructing Comics, but we're less than $10 away from our next goal, which would unlock 15 more episodes from 2006. Help us make our online episode archive more complete. Support us at patreon.com/deconcomics.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin Podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
All right, so now we're going to talk about the book, Kismet Man of Fate, Volume 1, Boston Strong. And actually, I had a little trouble reading this for a review because it has some problems that put me into critiquing comics mode, and I couldn't get past those problems. But I invited Will on because then I thought he would kind of keep me on track for a deconstructing comics type of review. So let's start with something positive. So the comic has Kismet trying to work against what he sees as fascist tendencies of Donald Trump, just as Kismet did against real undisputed fascists in World War II. And Will, you pointed out how Kismet in the book kind of changes from superhero to activist and how those two things are different.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting take to go, and it's one that's not without precedent. I was reminded of a Claremont comic from the X-Men, I believe. I could be wrong. I think it was X-Men Annual number 50 from the 1980s, where Dazzler imagines that she never became a superhero or a rock star. Instead, she became an attorney, and she winds up putting the Kingpin away, and that it was a better use of her time than running around, in a jumpsuit executing violence. So, it was interesting to me to see how, and the way it's placed by the author, that it's simple acts of collective defiance, of collective refusal of the status quo, which can amount to actual lasting ongoing change, which is a laudable and worthwhile moral message. Some of my objections to the piece were I felt that message and many of the best ideas contained within the piece and teased within the content were lost in the weeds of political expression. And I'm absolutely sure that our author would agree that the comic is something of a love letter to social justice politics. That's fine, of course. But it comes at the expense of really interesting, tantalizing, fascinating ideas that we only get the tiniest taste of. Now, in a lot of fiction, I like a tiny taste. I like that tiny taste that makes me think about things long afterwards, and this is where fanfic comes from. This is how you create fandom. So tantalizing is good, but a taste is just being mean.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there is a lot of politics in the story and a lot of real world events that are sort of affecting Kismet's story and these other characters who he's with. You heard Lewis say in the interview, he wanted to show Kismet had dealt with real fascism in the 40s and how he would deal with the rise of another authoritarian leader. Did you feel like that approach worked or not?
To an extent. It's not my main critique of the piece is that Kismet himself lacks a dramatic arc. And this is a fundamental thing. The character himself, and as we see in the end pieces, he sort of feels like by defying what little piece of fate that he can see, that few moments into the future that he can see, by trying to change it, it breaks reality. It fractures the universe. It sends him cartwheeling into the side space, which is also an extremely cool idea that is sort of like only given a superficial touch. Not that there's time to explore everything in a volume 1, but that's a cool sci-fi idea that has a lot of room for exploration. But the notion of, we'll come back to this as well, because the concept of fate, I think, is something that it was also lovely and worthy of future exploration in an additional series. But we don't see this fellow go through a legitimate transformation of soul. If one, first of all, is drop kicked by the hand of God into side space and pulled forth 70 years later, and the same enemy you were fighting is still raging or returning or rising from slumber, just as you are now risen from slumber, it would be a fascinating character study to see how that plays out. What does that mean to a person? How does that humble a person? How does that make that individual change? Now, we see Kismet change strategy by embracing little bits of collective action that change the status quo. But that doesn't necessarily change his character. And much of his expression, like the politics are, and the author said in the interview that he's trying to work on reducing the amount of verbiage. But the politics broke the rhythm of the narrative that we wanted to see, the A story, the B story, the background context, and the color became the focus, unfortunately. And it didn't permit Kismet to evolve as a character. Especially, like, we've got this guy from Algiers in 1944 who, like, at one point is confronted by his sister and her sister's lover, and they said, look, we're a couple, we are a lesbian couple. And Kismet says, oh yeah, great, it totally new.
Just like we had back in 1944.
Right, just like we had back in 1944. Now,
everybody was cool with it back then too.
Right. Addressing LGBT issues in comics it's a standard. It's a staple. We expect that. But we don't permit this character to grow into acceptance. Would it not be a more legitimate, satisfying, an arc that rings true if at first he objected or had something to come to grips with? Because, like we're talking about, I'm a Gen Xer, that's my grandparents' generation. I promise you, my grandparents' generation would not have responded as Kismet did, even if they had 70 years to watch from side space. So why deprive the character of the opportunity to achieve acceptance? I feel like he was concretized by the need to express moral conclusions without any opportunity for deviation, which could be interpreted as transgressive by modern sensibilities.
Yeah, well, was it like because he's the good guy and he's the voice of the author, he has to have these views from the beginning?
Sure.
There's nothing to work through. Absolutely. Like, sure, no problem.
Right. And like a character needs to grow. They need to change. They need to evolve. And there's beauty in watching a character grow up, even if that character is like middle 30s plus 70 years, however old Kismet is supposed to be in the story. Like that's the soul of drama. Give me that development.
I also didn't really like all the real world events playing out, because I mean, if Kismet's idea is that he has to stop the rise of an authoritarian leader in Trump, if we're tying it so close to reality, we know that Kismet's not going to accomplish anything, and so there's no tension in the story. Although, as it turns out, by the time you get to the end, it's sort of veered away from that a little bit, and it's focusing on what's happening with the fictional characters, which was, I mean, what else can you do if you... Because if you keep it so tied to actual things that Trump did, then Kismet's just like not having any effect at all.
Right, like the last scene and the first scene, like they felt good. I almost wish that the book used the first scene as the beginning. And like I think that there's something cool in certain works of fiction about dropping your reader into a giant world, but you can only see it through a keyhole. And then as the story progresses, you come to understand that world a little bit better. And I assumed that was the ride that I was on in the first couple of pages. But I myself, and other readers may disagree, but I personally could have benefited much more from being grounded in what happened first,
right,
rather than having to reassemble the pieces in my brain afterwards.
Well, as I said in the interview, starting out at the beginning of this book, I felt like I had been given volume 2 and I didn't know what happened in volume 1. So there are 5 stories in this book. Okay, so it starts out with this short story referencing the Pulse nightclub mass shooting from 2016. That story appeared in Geeked magazine and also as a free comic book day giveaway in 2017. And that's just a few pages. Then we have the 100-page main story, where at the beginning, Kismet is in side space. He's kind of a ghostly presence, and there are these other people. We have no idea who they are, and it's not laid out for us in any way, or it's just kind of, that's how it is. And I really felt disoriented, which made me irritated, and I think it kind of made me turn against the whole story, because you're not telling me things.
Well, I didn't mind that. Like, I'm personally, I didn't find it irritating. I thought it was itchy. It was like an itch that I want to read more so I could scratch the itch. Like that was tantalizing. It wasn't like that tiny taste that really didn't leave me unsatisfied. And I sort of liked his deliberation. Like where am I going to go? Like where am I going to emerge? What change am I going to apply to the world? Because that's an interesting idea too. A superhero has to choose his or her battles. They're not capable of being everywhere simultaneously. Some they're going to let get away because they're going to focus on the one they can stop. So that's of interest to me as well, as a person familiar with this genre and excited by this genre.
So then in the back, it felt like one story to me, but I asked David by email the other day, and he said it's actually 3 stories. So there's the story that takes place in the 40s, which originally appeared in the 2015 Broken Frontier anthology. And then there are 2 more stories which are appearing for the first time in this book. The one where Kismet arrives in 2014, and then the one where he's interviewed. And to my mind, those 3 stories should have been at the beginning, because it really gives you, grounding, like you said. You understand what's come before, and then we could have the Pulse nightclub story and the 100-page giant story.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think you always need to have the origin story first. Like, it's fine to ignore the prologue and maybe shove it in later, but I would have benefited from having it first, and I think that the content would have benefited too, because that interview segment is where the most fascinating ideas are introduced by the author. And here is where I'm going to bring up this topic of fate, of Kismet meaning fate. Because fate is a powerful concept. And it's different from, say, destiny, right? If you say, like, you're destined to do something, it almost sounds like a reward. You're going to do something, and then the gods are going to give you this cool outcome because you've rode along with the plans. It's like something you win. But fate for good or for ill, is a kind of doom. You can't escape it. You're locked into it. Powers greater than you have put that stone around your neck. You are fated, and you can't get rid of it. Fate has a potency to it that has extraordinary dramatic gravity. So, as a superpower, to be able to see just a little bit of fate, and then to decide to act against it, this is not just superheroism. This is archetypal, mythological, primordial human heroism that touches on matters spiritual and temporal. This is the power of this character. So then what do we know about this guy? We bring in his Algerian heritage, and we bring in the connection with Islam. And for me, like, the greatest piece of tantalizing content that went unrealized is when, during the interview, he's asked, did you pray while you were inside space? And he just kind of blows it off. He just kind of sloughs it off. It's like, yeah, well, like, when I was able to. Like, what do you mean we were able to? Like, what, you were busy? You had a lot of household chores to do for 70 years while you're looking at the universe? You better answer that question. You cannot pose that question and not have it answered, because once again, this connects to the idea of the character requiring a heroic arc and not getting the arc that he deserved, especially given that the really heady and very potent nature of the concepts introduced.
Yeah, well, and I mean, since most of us have never heard of this character before because he disappeared after his 4 appearances in 1944, we'd like to see him doing superhero stuff because he's a superhero. He's the first Muslim superhero. And you get the main story in this book, and he's like, man, I don't want to be a superhero anymore. I want to be an activist. And he never changes his mind. Spider-Man says, I'm not going to be a hero anymore. He throws his costume in the garbage. And at the end of the story, oh, no, I got to be a superhero. This is who I am. And Kismet never gets to that. He's made his decision, and he's sticking with it, and it's not very interesting.
Yeah, he's got to leave it for others. But he also, that decision is never challenged in a real way, even though they brought in the steampunker. And like there's a great line where, like, I can't remember it verbatim. I didn't type it down in my notes, but when she's interviewed, she says, like, I'm just a lone steampunk who wanted to make a difference. And there's a guy who's had the somewhat lifelong affiliation with punk. I've always wanted to be able to, like, say to somebody, I'm just a punk who wanted to make a difference. And in fact, you know what? That's on my bucket list. I'm putting that aside. That and I've always aspired to slam my fist down on a table and say this bickering is pointless. Hasn't happened yet. That's on my list, and so is the line about a punk who wants to make a difference.
Yeah, at your next faculty meeting, pound the table. This bickering is pointless, but we're not bickering. Yeah, so let's see, what else have I got here? Well, as David himself admitted, and you referred to also, the comic is a little too wordy. And I was particularly bothered by, there are a lot of places where, as people are talking, there are rather large narration boxes running through that are on a completely different track that have nothing to do with the conversation, or maybe at the end they kind of dovetail, but it's frustrating to read because I'm trying to keep track of 2 things at once. And, if the narration boxes were 5 words, it'd be one thing, but they're longer than the dialogue. So, I just found it kind of frustrating to read those sections.
In places, it also, I thought the art style was very unique, and it needed a little bit of room to breathe, free from text boxes. I liked the color scheme. It had the earth tones were unique, and it had a watercolor feel. I don't know if that was achieved with paint or digitally. but it had a dreaminess that I appreciated. The bold strokes of the inks were interesting as well. And I don't know how a lot of readers will feel about this, but in the flashback sequences where we see Kismet himself in action, his physicality in costume and in a fist fight, it reminded me a lot of Marv in Sin City. It had sort of the Frank Miller, like, huge shoulders, the giant protruding chin and nose and fists that had that, like, they just scream this, like, hyper masculinized daring do, which was somewhat at odds with the content, which I liked. I liked that there was juxtaposition because it implied a counterbalance. It was a subtle artistic interruption that made me stop and drink in the surroundings a little bit more carefully.
Okay. I wonder how you felt about this. So there are a number of places where Arabic words are used with no explanation. And I mean, I thought it's fine, Arabic words belong in the story, but I think you shouldn't leave your readers behind because most of us don't know these words.
Well, I didn't mind looking some of them up, but a lot of the things the characters would say would basically translate into it, like, if God wills it, or by the will of God, which again touches this fate idea, and I really wanted more of that. Another thing that this piece does not give us is a clear antagonist, that the antagonist is this shadowy notion of a rising fascism and like an ill-defined threat to the advance of human dignity. But what more powerful bad guy could you have than fate itself? I mean, if you've run afoul of fate, whether you are the Greeks or whether you are Kismet, you're talking about, like, a bad baddie and, like, a powerful villain, a genuine antagonist to test our hero against was necessary. I think it would have also made his introspection more profound because it would have greater stakes.
Now, I think in the 1940s story in the back, the guy who he tries to save his life even though he's fated to die is what, Lamont?
Yeah, and I was wondering if that was a subtle reference to the Shadow, but...
maybe. Then in the first chapter of the 100-page story, there's a woman whose last name is Lamont, and I assumed that maybe she was supposed to be a descendant of Lamont. And she sprays acid on some people in a hotel ballroom, and then she just kind of disappears. And I mean, I think in this kind of story where you're dealing with a quote unquote villain who is real, think about World War II stories. Usually, Captain America is not directly fighting Hitler; he's fighting fictional assistants to Hitler. And then, you're not so bound by real life events. You can have your hero beat that underling of the actual villain.
Yeah. Does Trump employ someone similar to Red Skull? I don't know. I'm going to look into that. I'm not saying the answer is no. Could be yes.
But, you could have kept this Ms. Lamont through the story and maybe have her be a member of Trump's cabinet or something, and activist Kismet could, I don't know, picket her office and take her to court and win or something. It's not a superhero story, but...
Yeah, again, we need an antagonist, a genuine antagonist. Not the many-faced hydra of a shadowy threat, even if it has legitimate real-world corollaries. It requires personification in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. You mentioned in your email that this might be too big of a topic, but something about stereotype versus archetype in portraying a hero from a different culture.
Yeah, absolutely. This ran through my head, and this would be one, I think, for the anthropologists in the audience to pipe up about, because this is not my skill set. But the notion when we're talking about a cross-cultural hero is, how do you portray that faithfully without resorting to stereotypes and instead calling upon archetypes? So if we look at the origin of this character, like, certainly there's some propagandist motivations there. I want to portray to the world that, like, everyone is on the side of the Allies, that it's a global effort to defeat the Axis. And here's one of the faces of that effort from Algeria. There's stereotyping going on there. It's absolutely unavoidable, from the fez to the shirtlessness.
Mm-hmm. Well,
like it's locked in. But
the 1940s story? Kismet gets his costume and he says, "Stupid fez."
Yeah.
So even he objects to the stereotyping.
Yeah, exactly. And there was the tiny little reference to Doctor Who and the Fez in one of those wordy background bubbles too, which I appreciated and couldn't miss. But that's a stereotype. What would an archetype of an Islamic hero be? And how might they differ? Kismet was written by Western authors to serve Western political ends. What's the archetype look like? Like, who is your archetypal Islamic hero? And I'm not sure that I'm well versed enough to have the answer. The one that came up in my mind was Saladin. So what do we know about him? A leader, man of honor, an inspiration, warrior, yes, but general first, politician. Do we see these characteristics incorporated into the Kismet character? Maybe I've got the wrong archetype. Maybe there's a different swashbuckler that we should be looking at here. And I'm sure it wouldn't take an educated person very long to come up with some suggestions. But I felt aware, especially given the politically leveraged content of the narrative, I felt aware that there was a cultural gap between the source material and the contemporary material. One I'd like to see filled.
Okay, a gap. What was missing in that gap?
Our flashback portrayals, as interesting as they were, and when you have this character whose name is this concept of fate, and who has a sister who prays as part of a devout ritual, and when you are using Arabic words to exclaim your fate, let's have a connection to that culture that is not based on 1940s propaganda from the American war effort.
Okay, well, yeah, it's interesting to talk about. It would be nice if it's too bad Kismet doesn't have more of a backstory. I don't know. Of course, I don't know what would have happened, like, if, you know, a lot of those old small comic companies were bought up by what became Marvel or DC, and kind of, especially DC, and kind of swallowed into that universe. I wonder what would have happened to Kismet, like, if DC had bought his original publisher, and, you know, he was fighting alongside Superman and Batman now.
Yeah, would he have been in the Justice League?
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well...
Actually,
go ahead.
You'd have a pretty good place in the Justice League. Like, I could see a little bit of foresight gelling really nicely with teeing up your Wonder Woman or the Flash, for sure. Kismet plus Flash is a pretty good combo.
Yeah, well, if you can anticipate what's going to happen in the next few seconds and then move really quickly, you can really take advantage of that foreknowledge.
It's handy. It's very handy.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for discussing this with me.
By all means. Pleasure's mine.
Kismet Man of Fate, Volume 1, Boston Strong, is published by A Wave Blue World. Want to support this podcast? You can help us out by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. This Saturday, Mulele and I critique Terminal Velocity by Barry Corbett. Unfortunately, Patrick and I have not managed to stir up much interest in our Full Metal Alchemist review podcast, The Law of Equivalent Exchange. But we recorded the first 3 episodes way back in March, and we'd like to make them available. So next week, rather than a Deconstructing Comics episode, you'll hear the first episode of The Law of Equivalent Exchange, with the subsequent 2 episodes coming sometime in the next few months. So join us for an overview of Hiromu Arakawa's Full Metal Alchemist and discussion of the first chapter of the story next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.